Hello, this is Shafali, and this is Willow. This is our other cat. He's a ragdoll, and he likes to say hello as well. Hello. Okay. So I have some notes today. Today I decided that I was going to do perhaps less of an inspired talk, more of an informative talk about something that I wished I'd heard when I was sort of 40 years ago, actually, because I don't think a lot is said about relationships, especially friendships. So this talk is going to be called Navigating Friendship. I found it bewildering to enter the adult world and really not know the kind of things that influence our relationships. So since I've retired, though, I have actually done a lot more research and read some books, listened to some podcasts, and so I'm just sharing some of my thoughts. This is not going to be an exhaustive education about how we should conduct our relationships. It's just some of my reflections. What I won't do is I am not going to talk about the minefield that is romantic relationships. So nowhere near that. So if we're talking about close friendships, we're talking about love. And C.S. Lewis talks and he says that that there are 4 different kinds of love, and in the Greek there is eros, which is romantic love. There is agape, which is divine love, God's love. And then there are storge relationships. That's love based on siblings or family. And then there's philo, which is a bit of an interchange with just platonic friendships. So this talk is going to be about storge and philo. We're not going to go into God's love or romantic relationships. So all I'm going to do is give you some analogies, give you a bit of a story, and give you some things that perhaps you might want to look into more, like attachment theory or vulnerability. So as a start, I'm going to talk about how I like to see relationships, close relationships, and the analogy is one of a bridge. So loosely, so I'm not an architect, but if I'm going to start building a bridge, I will start building it from one end, and the other person is going to start building it from the other end. So first of all, there is mutuality, and that's very important. You both want to be building this bridge towards each other so that you're going to meet in the middle. If only one person is building this bridge and they keep building and the other person isn't really building anything, then what you get is a diving board, perhaps less than ideal if you're doing it over a chasm. So what are the things that go into, that feed into, and that strengthen or weaken the bridge that we're building? And that is what I'm going to say. So once we've built the bridge and it's even connected, there are also things that will feed into the relationship that will strengthen it. So we're both building towards each other and we're trying to reinforce the structure. So the first thing we bring is our mutual desire for the relationship. And that's important. So we're both going to work at it simultaneously and independently. I also think that good communication, effective communication, is essential, because without that there is misunderstanding. So what I've learned is that 80% of our communication is non-verbal. So non-verbal meaning our facial expressions, our tone of voice, our posture. If I'm leaning forward, I'm much more interested in you. If I'm just sitting back and I'm kind of gazing around, less so. So eye contact is very, very important. So communication is at its highest when we're seeing people and we're meeting people face to face, because that's when we're interacting and we can respond to each other. What I consider is the probably the lowest form of communication, the one where there is most misunderstanding, is if we're texting or emailing, because we cannot see a smile on somebody's face and we cannot see a frown on somebody's face. So we don't know what they're thinking of, what their intentions are necessarily when they're sending that email. And we can infer things that maybe are not even there. The other thing that we need is vulnerability. And vulnerability has been covered beautifully by Brené Brown. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what she's said and summarise it. However, just hold that thought a moment. This is the book that I've you see it's the other way around. It's called Braving the Wilderness by Brené Brown. And I read that, but she's written a number of other books as well, which I recommend. Very interesting, very down to earth, and very accessible. And she talks about how we need to be vulnerable with each other. Vulnerability is actually important for us as human beings. It's part of the way we connect with each other. And though it's, here we go, risky, it is something that we need to have the courage to do, because actually it will be worth our while in the end. She describes the anatomy of trust. So if I said to you, what do you trust me? If somebody asked me that question, I go, well, I think so. What do you mean by trust? And so she's given an acronym that I find is quite useful to talk about how trust is built and what makes up that trust. And I find it very, very good to sort of think about. So the first thing, so the acronym is BRAVING, BRAVING. So if we start with B, that stands for boundaries. That, to expand on that a bit, it's what is not okay for me and what is okay for me. And that is very, very useful to know. We need to know ourselves what is okay for me, and I need to know what is okay for another person, and their boundaries may be different for different reasons, and that needs to be kind of found out as we're building our relationship. R stands for reliability. So we do what we say. If we say we're going to do something, get on and do it when you say you're going to do it. And if you can't, then you've got to explain why, rather than just, oh well, it just didn't happen. That's not going to build trust. A is accountability. We need to take responsibility, each of us, for our own mistakes, and we need to make amends, apologise. So I take responsibility for my part, and any part in any conflict, and the other person has to take responsibility for theirs too. V stands for vault, and this is the one that I found a little bit more kind of difficult to remember. And what that means is you're locking something away. When somebody tells you something, even if perhaps you don't realise that it's sensitive to that person, you don't share that unless you have permission. So this is about confidentiality. And as a doctor, I understand extremely well about confidentiality because we have that as part of our code of conduct. And what that does is it makes people feel safe to share. When you go to a doctor, you expect to be able to say absolutely anything to them and it will be kept confidential unless it's of danger to you or to other people, of course. I stands for integrity, and it's about, integrity means practicing your values, not just speaking about them. Actions are louder than words always. So integrity. N stands for non-judgmental. So when you're talking to each other, you've got to be able to talk about how you feel without being judged. There has to be an acceptance. We don't have to agree, we just have to be non-judgmental. And finally, G stands for generosity. And generosity is about how we can generously interpret the words and actions of others. I'll give you an example. So I'm walking along the street and I see a friend coming in my direction, and they seem to be, looking around, but they don't acknowledge me. They don't wave, say hi. And I think, have we fallen out? Has she gone off me? Have I offended her? A generous interpretation would be, maybe she was a bit distracted, maybe she had other things on her mind. I need to probably find out. For the moment, I'm going to think that she was just distracted and she just didn't see me because she was too distracted. Okay. So then I go back to my friend and I say, hey, Katie, I saw you in the street the other day and you just didn't say hello. Is something going on, or do we have a problem? And if Katie's more likely to say, oh, it was a dreadful day when I went into town. I'd had all kinds of stuff going on in the morning, and I think when I went into town, I was just in a world of my own, completely distracted. And that's fine. And you see, and straight away, so you're not coming from a point of view of, oh, you just blanked me. You're coming from a point of view of, well, what was going on? And it's always worth knowing what the back story may be to something that you don't really know. And that's where communication comes in. We've got to have the courage to be able to ask those questions. We've got to be curious, and we've got to be able to hear the answer and be kind about it. So the second thing I want to talk about is something that I've come to learn about very recently, and it is attachment theory. Originally, this was proposed by the psychologist John Bowlby, and I've tried to read a bit more about it. I have found a book that is called How We Love, that's it the wrong way round, by Milan and Kay Yerkovich. And there they talk about how we relate to each other depending on how we learnt to make attachments when we were growing up in our formative years. Now, this isn't about pigeonholing people. This isn't about saying, oh, you belong with that label, or I belong with that label. But what it is saying is we react, and we act in certain situations based out of the kind of imprint we had when we were children. So the fact that I was brought up in a household that was a little bit tense, and I was a little bit scared of my dad, and that will affect, even though I'm unaware of it, will affect maybe sometimes how I react to other people who are tense, who I can see are tense, and I may just tense up because somewhere in the back of my mind, totally unconsciously, I am remembering those times. And other people who have been securely connected, they will react in a completely different way, and they don't see anything, and they're much more relaxed. So in the attachment theory, it gives you certain patterns where we connect with each other. And what Milan and Kay Yerkovich are talking about, their book says, Discover Your Love Style, Enhance Your Marriage. I don't think this is just about marriage. This can affect all of our close friendships, not just a marriage relationship. So they give certain behaviour patterns, and then they talk about the childhoods that kind of produce those. And of course, we're all going to be a mixture of those. But what it's doing is it's giving us pointers as to where we're coming from, and how we have connected. And the big question is, how was comfort communicated to you as you were growing up in your family? Now, I don't think I've ever been asked that question before. How were you comforted? And that's not about when you fall and graze your knee and you get up. They're referring to a more traumatic or a more eventful time. What did your parents do to comfort you? And the elements of comfort include listening, contact, and then providing relief. And that relief is that sense of comfort. Now, a lot of people cannot say that they consistently received comfort when they were children. So that is not an uncommon response, and all is not lost. And that's exactly why they've written the book, because it tells you how to deal with and how to grow through those experiences, and how to receive comfort now, and how we can help each other receive comfort in a way that is going to speak to each of us as individuals. So what they've done is they've given some attachment styles, they've described them, and then they give growth goals. And they've also talked about how one personality affects another one. And they talk a little bit about that, what happens when we come together, how do we react, why do we react that way. And I found it an absolute revelation, and I recommend the book, of course. I don't get any credits for this book, right? No credits at all. So we've talked about vulnerability, we've talked about attachment style, and within that, learning about comfort, part of the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how was anger or conflict handled in your family? And that is also very important. What did you see? How did you see your parents deal with conflict? All relationships are going to experience conflict at some point. And it's how we react in that conflict situation, and how we can bring ourselves through conflict to resolution, and a little bit of what goes on inside when we're faced with conflict, whether we avoid it, whether we brush it under the carpet, whether conflict makes us angry, or whether actually it's a relief to be able to express disagreement and not be judged for it or criticised, but actually to have an engagement in that disagreement. Because you can disagree with people that you love, and that doesn't mean that you're disrespecting them. What it means is that you can have healthy disagreement and maintain the relationship through that. So if we come to the Christian context, Jesus talked about relationships, and most of the New Testament is about relationships within the church. Now, when I talk about the church, to quote Adrian Plass in one of his books, the church is the people, not the building. So it's about relationships within the church. I think in the church setting, relationships grow by sharing life together. That's how we have brother and sister relationships. There has to be unmasking and being able to be real, authentic. Otherwise, we're acting out a relationship rather than engaging. And that takes courage, and it also takes curiosity. Curiosity is one way of getting around fear. If we find something scary, if we think about it, that we're interested in it, that will actually engage us enough to overcome the fear to take that step. Time is needed, and we need to be intentional about making connections. We have to navigate conflict like we have to navigate conflict with our siblings and our parents, and we have to navigate it so that we can come through the other side. And that's part of bridge building. Now, the thing with building a bridge is, if the bridge is not reinforced, if we've not given it, our relationships, enough time, and we enter into conflict, even if it's healthy, you can bomb that bridge. You can just crash that bridge down because it's not actually yet on a secure foundation. But navigating conflict helps to strengthen that bridge if it's done in a good way at the right time. We have to learn about forgiveness and being forgiven. There has to be respect and honour, and we need to keep our word and not be a flake. Relationship is so much more than meeting each other. It is unpredictable and messy, and that is part of good relationships. So where in the Bible does it refer? Well, I could just say read the whole of the New Testament, but I'm just going to give you a few verses that will point you to some of the key ideas. Jesus said in Matthew 22 verses 37 to 39, love God and your neighbour as yourself. Now, that means you need to be able to love yourself, and we need to know ourselves well enough to love ourselves. And that's where learning about our attachment styles, our love styles, that will tell us a bit more about ourselves. And then we can, from that point of loving ourselves, we can love God and our neighbour. In 1 Corinthians 13, this is the mandate to love. Paul was writing to the Corinthian church, and what he was saying was, we can have all the gifts, we can prophesy, we can do this, do that, raise the dead even, but if we don't have love, then it is pretty pointless. That it's worthless. All our efforts are worthless if we don't have love, and practical love in action. Brené Brown says that the most compassionate people, those who display the most love, have very, very strong boundaries. So that is a key towards loving. And I found that quite interesting that she said that, because I would have thought that the most compassionate people would have no boundaries, but they're the most boundaried. In John 13 verses 35, Jesus said, by this shall you be known as my disciples, that you love one another. Loving one another in relationship and in a community is very, very attractive. I think in this modern society that we live in, the Western modern society, there has been quite a breakdown of family and of community and social relationships. Being sociable and having relationships is very important for our health. I've just read a book by Gabor Mate called When the Body Says No, and he says that it is in our connections and being sociable that we can actually become more healthy. So I think that there is a lot of loneliness around now, because our mindset in the West tends to be more individualistic, and I think in the church we need to show there is a different way, and we can welcome in the lonely people and make relationships that are worth having. So, to sum up, relationships are worth building and they're worth having. And we can maintain relationships with someone we disagree with by putting the relationship before ideals or theology. We can build trust. Relationships must be built on trust, which includes degrees of vulnerability. And the way that we interact and connect with people is affected by our love style or attachment style that is worth looking at. We also bring our whole life experiences, all from childhood, all the way through. So when you meet another adult, they have a whole life that they've had before them, before they've met you. And part of the discovery of the whole person is to discover some of where they've come from. And we need to remember that. If the reason why we can have good relationships or different relationships with our siblings or people or friends that we've known from school is because they've been through us through our formative years, so they know the whole backstory. They've been around and they've been there. There has to be mutuality in friendships, good communication, effective communication, and we have to realise that we cannot be friends with everyone. There are levels of friendship. Let us try and build meaningful relationships and help each other to move forward and love each other. Thank you for listening.